Hello and welcome to Profiles in Leadership. This Profiles in Leadership series offers an unparalleled opportunity to glean insights from top leaders who serve in government, education, the private sector, and civil society. In each episode, we invite these leaders to reflect on their journey and share skills, core values, and qualities that make them the leaders they are today. Today, we are privileged to have Professor Lateef Mtima, who is the founder and director of the Institute for IP and Social Justice. He is also professor of law at the Howard University School of Law, where he regularly teaches courses in intellectual property law and commercial law. Professor Mtima is a graduate of Amherst College and Harvard Law School, where he was the co-founder and later editor-in-chief of the Harvard Blackletter journal. So welcome, Lateef.
Well, thank you so much, Daryl. It is both a pleasure and a privilege to be here, especially not only a great opportunity to have another conversation with you, but to be somehow included in a program on profiles in leadership. I mean, just that title alone is a boost.
Well, as our viewers will see, it was an easy choice, and we have so much to cover and so much to talk about with respect to the exciting things you've been doing. Let's start with the 20th anniversary of your conference. So over 2 days, there were two related events. I had the privilege and the pleasure of being at both of them. So tell us about these events and how they're connected to the Institute.
Yeah, no, that's great. The IP and Social Justice Continuing Legal Education Program was the first program that the Institute established. And the idea was that when you think about social justice in the IP context, the first hurdle is getting people to understand that social justice or IP social justice is not an oxymoron. 20 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago, when I first just sort of formulated and just coined that as a phrase, IP social justice, and then adopted a particular definition. The response was that, well, these two things don't go together at all. Now, I certainly was not the first to point out that the IP system can and should be more socially responsive. And in our forthcoming book for Cambridge, the IP Social Justice Handbook, in the opening chapter, that's one of the things that we discuss in detail. We lay out, what I perceive as a history of social justice thought and scholarship in the IP field. But I think what we brought to the discussion were two things. One, the notion that social justice is not only consistent and compatible with the IP regime, but we brought in the notion that it is essential to it, right? That there is this interdependent relationship between IP achievement in the political economy and diversity, equity, and inclusion, or as we have articulated it, socially equitable access, inclusion, and empowerment, right? That if what the IP system is all about is to develop our greatest natural resource, which is human capability, right? And if that's what you're trying to do, you've got to make certain that as many and as a diverse group of human beings as possible are all participating in this enterprise. And so that was something that we brought to the conversation, that this was not longer just a consideration, this is something that has to be. And so as I began to formulate that scholarly and then to share that perspective, I found that the most fertile opportunity for disseminating that idea was interestingly more available in the practicing profession than it was in the scholarly academy. Scholarly academy, first off, was surprisingly resistant to the idea. Folks who were pro-IP were sort of stuck in that mindset that this is all about, economic rights and not thinking about anything else. And then you have the other segment of the IP Academy that is against what they perceive as IP maximalist. And they're so focused on containing IP rights that it didn't occur to them, well, there's a way in which you can get IP to be more socially responsive, and you don't have to be limited to just curtailing IP. So as a result, neither side in the scholarly academy, was sufficiently open to it, with the exception of a small group that had been pushing for more socially responsive IP regime since the 80s and 90s. But in the profession, I found that once you were able to explain to them what IP social justice is not, once you were able to overcome that prejudice, that the first thing, I would say after, making the presentation a couple of times, I realized that what I have to say right off the bat is IP social justice is not about doing away with all economic rights. It's not about saying that anybody and everybody who wants to grab any IP that they want, all they have to do is be able to take it, right? It's not about any of those types of things. Once I did that, the profession, particularly the judiciary, but many practicing IP attorneys were like, oh, well then what is it about? They were genuinely interested, right? The other reason that the CLE program was the first program was I was already doing a lot of CLE lectures. And of course, in those days, now we're going back to like the mid-90s, typically there might be an audience of 100 attendees, and maybe there might be one or two people of color in the audience. Almost always, I would be the only person of color on the panel, as a faculty member in the program. So those two things came together for me. It seemed that what we needed to do was here it is. On the one hand, we have this welcoming group, the profession, that they're open to these ideas. And there's clearly a need, to bring more people into IP practice. And so the idea was, well, let's get a CLE program, off the ground that will focus on both cutting edge developments and the social justice obligations and effects of the intellectual property regime. I shared this idea with, excuse me, a partner at the Finnegan firm, Tom Irving. This was back in 2001 when we were traveling together during the unfortunate events of 9/11. And we were on a bus together going from one CLE program to the other. And together we just laid out what the program would look like. And we thought that by presenting the program initially at Howard Law School, this would bring people in. And we got a boost from the Federal Circuit. Both former Chief Judge Paul Michel and Judge also on the Federal Circuit, Judge Richard Lynn, they both attended and spoke at the first program, set this wonderful precedent, such that we've had judges participate in the program all 20 years. And just to sort of wrap it up, to answer the other part of your question, it was through that not only did we have all these IP people coming to the program, most often we would do it typically at Howard Law School, interacting with Howard Law students, but the Howard Law students seeing the impact of that opportunity, the networking opportunities. Every year, some student would say, I got my summer job, or I got my permanent position by being a part of this conference. And then one of those students, Charlie Bingham, after he went on and worked at Microsoft, he came up with the idea to do what was initially a Howard Tech Summit program, because he saw the benefit that he got from being, a part of the CLA, and thought of, what if we added a day that focused specifically on students as opposed to alumni, people who were practicing. And we did that. We started that, I'd say, like roughly 5 years ago. And we quickly expanded it from a Howard program to an HBCU program. And so this year, as you noted at the outset, we just celebrated the 20th anniversary of the CLE program, and also, I believe, the 5th anniversary of the IP and Tech Law Summit.
What a wonderful journey. Tell us, when you were sitting there on that Friday, as we were going through the agenda, in fact, the day before, because there was a celebration.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate to see really the stakeholders that you mentioned and the warm outpouring, not just of admiration, but of gratitude for your tireless work in this. You've had now about a week since then to decompress and reflect. So what are some of your takeaways from this being the 20th anniversary?
I would say easily the most significant and most enduring takeaway that, even while we were going through the celebration, struck me and has stayed with me, is the comprehensively collective nature of this endeavor. As you saw at the evening before, and then throughout the program on Friday, most of the participants, this was not their first time being there with us. Most people have been with the program for many years. Almost all of the people who were involved in year one are still involved, right? And so what has struck me was that, sometimes a very simple idea is just waiting to just get out there, right? And then people will all jump on board. And it's so interesting how this is just so consistent with the very concept, right? The very concept is that if you want the best and most IP, the system has to be affirmatively and aggressively inclusive. And when you look at our CLE program, it's like, well, wait a minute, that actually embodies that. It actually manifests that. Anybody who would just look across the room at the dinner celebration, or just look at the panelists and presenters doing the CLE program, I can say easily, hands down, it is the most diverse CLE conference in the country. People from all over the country, all different walks of life, different communities, minorities, women, everybody, in it. And it's been that way throughout. And so it's just so interesting how what we were striving for, in theory, has actually occurred in practice. And what has made this program sustainable over 20 years has been that characteristic.
Let me ask you this, Lateef, because you have many colleagues at Howard Law School, and they are quite content teaching. They do some committee work. They write a few articles, and they get on with their life. And for the most part, that's all that's expected. You have gone over and above this. And we see probably just the tip of the iceberg and the many long hours and thankless things that you have been doing in order to make this a reality. What drives you?
That is such a very good question. One reason why it's such a very good question is because, yes, on the one hand, we do have a tradition of activism at Howard. And so it's no surprise, right, that most of us get involved in something. But what drives me in particular, and especially in this sort of like off-center space, right? I mean, because IP is not considered a part of the traditional civil rights mission by many people, including some people at Howard. This is not, a mainstream issue alone. And so what motivates me, in this unique space? And I have to say, it really goes back to, coming of age during the 60s and 70s, at a time in which activism was just a part of the air, and as our society has evolved and, we've sort of moved away from that as being, a part of everyday life, you come of age and then you come to a place like Howard and you're starting to think about, okay, well, I still want to do that type of stuff. This is how I was reared. Where can I make a difference? Doesn't matter that that type of thing isn't in the newspapers as much anymore, right? What can I do? And realizing that values and social and political objectives, they evolve, they change. And so the types of things that maybe some of us were really interested in back in the 60s and 70s are no longer at the top of everyone's list. And you have to accept the fact that you don't have the right to say to people, even in your own communities, you need to stick with those goals. You need to stick with that agenda. So I had to think about, all right, well, where's my place now? And because I had been an IP practitioner, and because I immediately saw, some of the deficiencies that we talked about earlier, I said, you know what, this could be a great combination, to bring this to Howard and to work on these issues through the Howard lens. And certainly it would have a unique impact, right? I'm not, recreating the wheel. I'm not just adding my voice to a pre-existing course. I can be rest assured that any progress that we're able to make, we can say, yeah, okay, so this is unique. This is something that collectively, if we hadn't gotten together, it probably wouldn't happen, or it certainly wouldn't happen in the same way. And so I think that that's what has really motivated me throughout all of these years. This is something unique and something that's necessary. And it doesn't just benefit one part of our society, it benefits our society as a whole.
Did you feel sitting there that evening and thinking about this is the 20th anniversary, that DEI, that social justice, has come of age? It took 20 years for the rest of the world to catch up and realize this was an important issue. But now you see it at every conference. In fact, conferences are probably stigmatized for not having a session focused on DEI. Has IP and social justice come of age?
I think so. I think that we have reached a point in the way in which we think about IP, that we have reached that watershed moment. I don't think we will ever be able to go back and to think about IP as purely as a system of economic incentives to get people to be engaged in IP production. I think that now that the genie is out of the bottle, so to speak, and people have been able to see that embracing these concepts is in no way a threat to the IP system. It actually uplifts it and broadens its appeal and its impact. There's no way to turn around. Instead of our having a dichotomy between the IP haves and the IP have-nots, right? With everybody else in society who are not directly benefiting from IP commercialization and distribution, being suspicious of IP. Instead of everybody thinking, oh, well, IP is something that it's just the way that the major IP holders, like, entertainment and recording industry, and that this is how it just keeps us from being able to do the things that we want to do, to charge us, crazy prices. Instead, both sides have begun to see, oh, wait a minute, the more people involved, the better. I have IP, even though I'm an everyday person, right? And it's one of the things that even in terms of the sort of the divisions, both in our society in general and but with respect to IP in particular, you have the divisions between traditional IP content holder entities, rights holders, and then tech users. But IP social justice is an aspect of the IP topography that both sides can agree on, right? More people come into the IP system today through the tech sector, right? There are people through social media influences, digital entrepreneurs. They're learning about how, oh, this is great. This is even better if I learn about my IP rights and I utilize IP in that context. And of course, on the content side, hey, the more everyday people who develop and pursue and exploit their IP, the more they understand our side of the situation. Okay, so I think that this new IP social justice awareness is something that has vital. It's a coming of age, and I don't think we'll ever go back.
Do we need to do anything to institutionalize the progress we have seen in the last 20 years?
Yes, yes. I think we have done some good things in that respect, and I think we should continue to build upon it. So, for example, one thing that I have been very happy about, as you know, just this past December, President Biden signed into law the Unleashing American Innovators Act. And this, of course, was a bipartisan bill. Senators Leahy and Tillis introduced it, and then later Senator Geronimo joined. And this was really the first. I mean, there have been other DEI sort of sensitive legislation like the Success Act in the past, but this is really the first, just aggressively affirmative attempt on the part of Congress to say, hey, okay, we're leaving a lot of opportunity and accomplishment and potential on the cutting room floor. Let's figure out how do we get out there into all parts of the country and make certain that everybody is participating. And indeed, it recognizes, for example, that some of these deficiencies in terms of having everybody participate, some of these things, this is not like finger pointing, right? Some of these deficiencies, they were unintentional. I mean, so for example, one of the things that the Act addresses is to increase the number of satellite offices and also to add in a new type of a function, community outreach offices, right? Now, first, the fact that prior to the AIA, the American Invents Act, that we just had the patent office, right? Obviously, if you lived in New York or Virginia, it was easier for you to get to the patent office than if you lived in California. But that wasn't intentionally discriminating against the West, right? But it obviously had that impact. And so we have this effort to sort of, well, let's correct that, right? The addition of the increasing the satellite offices and this new community outreach function further addresses that, right? So not only does the Act look at the region of the United States and say, okay, we need new satellite offices. We need something in the Southeast. We need something in the Northeast, way up in New England. These are areas that aren't being sufficiently serviced in terms of IP innovation and getting to the patent office. But the innovation of the community outreach office, this is a new function that will be placed in regions that don't have a satellite office, right? And the purpose of the community outreach is literally that. This is not like the USPTO or a satellite office in which it's now geographically easier for you to come to. No, the community outreach office, their job is to go out into the community, right? Specifically to partner with community organizations, right? That could be everything from an activist organization to a church to a local social club, right? To bring IP to the people. And that would include everything from grassroots IP education, right? People understand, wait, that's IP? Oh, I didn't realize that, right? To assisting them in helping them to find their pathway to get to a satellite office, to get to the US Patent Office, to be connected with the USPTO Patent Pro Bono program. So I think that we have begun something, but now what we have to do is we can't rest on that laurel. There's more that we can do. I think one of the most important things that we need to do next is to encourage and assist Congress in developing a national IP identity and agenda. I think we now need to move to the point in which everybody in this country has some idea as to what IP is, and we begin to have Americans think about IP the way that we think about, for example, athletics. You know, if you're a small child and you show any interest or capability in athletics, I don't care where you live in this country, there is a ready pipeline. There are school programs, there are after-school programs, there are community programs, all beginning at K through 12 and all the way up, right? We don't have anything like that for IP, right? We need to approach IP education and awareness and participation in the same way, right?
So talk about the US IP Alliance and how that is connected to this nationwide vision.
Yes, great question. So the US IP Alliance, which was formed, I think, a little less than 2 years ago, has embraced and is working to implement this sort of a vision, to look at what we can do to enhance the IP regime and enhance IP participation and collaboration, pervasively, just throughout society in many different ways. It's to make certain that IP innovators and creators, that they're getting whatever support that they need to not only create and invent, but to commercialize and distribute and make sure that we're all working together collaboratively. There are very concrete DEI initiatives as part of USIPA to just make certain that we pull everybody together. But also there are education initiatives that focus not only in the traditional spaces like law schools, right? Because we already know about IP, but there are some law schools that don't have IP programs, but in non-traditional spaces, community colleges, all undergraduate schools, and most importantly, K through 12, right? So, USIPA, what they've done is, we've kind of created this mechanism through which we can now collectively work with Congress. We can present the proposals and the ideas and to say, hey, you know what you guys have already done with the Unleashing American Inventors Act, this is how we take it to the next stage.
It's great. And a great segue from moving away from saving the world back to you, Lateef. And they say the child's the father of the man. So people's formative experiences, whether they're as children or even in college and universities, has a lasting impact on who they are as people, what they see their mission as. Reflect for a moment and share with us, what were your formative experiences during your formative years?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because that's so central to who I am and what I do. I mentioned earlier, growing up in the 60s and 70s, how that sort of shaped your sense of social responsibility. I'm also a part of the traditional immigrant story. My parents were immigrants from the Caribbean, so I'm first generation born. And as is, consistent with most immigrant stories. You know, you're here to take advantage of the many opportunities and privileges that we don't see in other places around the world. What are you going to do to take advantage of that, not only to improve your life, but the lives of your family and the people in your community? How are you going to give back to the society that provided you with these privileges and benefits that you would not otherwise have? And the incredible work ethic and social responsibility ethic that I saw in my household through my parents. They did not have extensive education. You know, my dad, who was the primary breadwinner, had not finished high school. And as you would expect, emphasized education. You know, my mother was what was in those days a traditional stay-at-home mom who her entire focus, her entire priority was making certain that all 5 of her kids not only pursued education, but were socially responsible, always did the right thing. And I can't overemphasize that, especially when I have read in subsequent years, like statistics about, well, if you were a young Black male who grew up in Harlem in the 1960s, statistically speaking, this is where you would be now. And I'm like in this like 0.5% of being where I am and
Yeah, an outlier, but in a good way.
right, exactly. Okay. And
So
I have to
go ahead.
contribute that to them. No, but I have to contribute that to them because I grew up in the same environment as everybody else. So what was the determinative factor?
So you went to Amherst and then you went to Harvard.
Mhm.
Tell us what that meant to you and to your family.
Yeah. So I guess for me, it sort of began by having the opportunity to go to one of the specialized high schools in New York City. So I went to Stuyvesant High School. And this, of course, was before the days of the, those special after-school programs you could pay for to teach you how to take the test or what have you. So in those days, I think access was a bit more democratic, right? Wherever you went to school in New York City, you took the test, and whether you went to a strong school or a weak school, if you did well, you got in. And that sort of set a nice path because obviously being at a specialized high school, it meant that it was going to raise your awareness about, colleges. But for my being at Stuyvesant, I would never have known that a school like Amherst even existed. Before going to Stuyvesant High School, I knew that there was something called college, and I knew that there was a community college and also city college, somewhere not too far. Beyond that, I really didn't have a concept. Learned about colleges and opportunities at Stuyvesant. And then when I had the opportunity to go to Amherst, I mean, that just totally reshaped my entire worldview. I mean, here it is. I had already gone from what we used to call the inner city, Harlem in those days, to this, the Stuyvesant, which a more diverse, experience. But now I'm at this tiny place in Amherst, Massachusetts, in New England, whole different lifestyle, and just totally broadened my perspective as to what you could learn about, what you could do, particularly with the liberal arts, education. Of course, it was also at the tail end of the 70s, and activism was everywhere. It seems like almost every week there was some sort of a protest. Those were the days in which college students were still calling for American corporation, divestiture in the old South Africa. Okay. So, whether it was that, whether it was women's rights, whether it was the still developing gay rights movement, I mean, Amherst was just, like most schools, but it being this tiny little liberal arts community, one of the things that I've always said about it is that, I was very, socially active and I guess politically active at Amherst. And recently going back, some people were like, oh, you really have a very fond memory of your time at Amherst, but things were so chaotic. You were so involved. I said, the thing that I took away from that was that although I was oftentimes at odds with some of the traditional, ideals and values at Amherst, what I never lost sight of was the fact that this was a place that allowed me to protest, right? I mean, I was never expelled or anything like that. I mean, and so lots of people were able to find their voices, and it really encouraged and cultivated that. It also obviously made it possible for me to go to Harvard Law School, which, as a kid in Harlem, of course, would never have been on my mind or a concrete goal. And then to be in that arena was certainly a little bit mind-boggling. And in academically, I was prepared, but professionally and socially, I look back and I see many things that had I come up in a different context, right? I mean, if I had had family members who were attorneys, right? If I had been more part of the mainstream society, know more about business and corporations and government. I think I took advantage of things, but I could have taken advantage of much more. There were things that it wasn't until after I graduated that, oh, wow, that was a thing and I could have done that. So it was definitely a mind expanding experience that I can still look back and say, ooh, whereas I think I did everything I possibly could at Amherst. There are some things that, again, perhaps with more institutional support, I might have taken more advantage of the possibilities at a place like Harvard Law School.
And did it make a difference to your family that you went to Amherst and Harvard?
Yeah, I think especially Harvard, right? Because the thing of it is that they totally understood the value of my being able to go to a place like Stuyvesant High School. They pretty much understood that Amherst was something of a special place. But small New England school, immigrant family, they had but when you say Harvard Law School, even the folks in our community, right? And so it was something for us all as a family to be very proud of, but also in a very traditional, stoic West Indian way, right? Because there wasn't a lot of talk about it. It was just sort of like understood, okay, keep it up, but
Well, you raised the bar. Was there any pressure on your siblings and their kids?
I don't know. I'll have to ask them. I mean, so I'm the middle child. So I don't think there was a whole lot of pressure on my older brother and sister because they had already, my younger brother and sister, I'm certain to some degree, there was, okay, so what are you going to do? But fortunately, even though my parents never had the benefit of a college education, all five of us not only went to college, but let's see, I think three of us went on to either graduate or professional school. So again, we never really talked about it a whole lot, Stoic West Indian family, but I really appreciate the fact that my folks got to see all of that before they passed, got to see us all graduate, to see what we ultimately did. And they would never have crowed about it, but we have all felt that we look at and say, wow, look at what these two people accomplished, right? I mean, these are two people who were reared in the British colonial system. I mean, when they were growing up in the 1920s and 30s and 40s in the Caribbean islands, okay, those were just colonies, right? With the very, very limited opportunities for the indigenous people. And my folks came from that, came to the United States, and now here they are, decades later, seeing their kids go to college. And my one small regret was that when I had the opportunity to testify before Congress in support of the Unleashing American Innovation Act, my mom had passed a few years earlier. My dad had just passed, just like, say like a month or two. But he did have a chance to see lots of things. And so they certainly, they knew what they had achieved.
What a wonderful legacy. Now, speaking of legacies, while you were at Harvard, you co-founded something, co-founded the Harvard Blackletter Journal. So tell us what inspired you and where's the journal today?
Okay. So I looked around and I saw that although there were journals, there were no journals that did anything that focused on the law from perspectives that would be of particular interest to people of color, especially the African American community. We had something there that was called I think it was called the Blackletter, but it was just a newsletter. And it was just a way for students to, talk about things. And here's a little latest development, but it was in no way was it a law review. And I thought that, well, if we have that, well, we really should expand it. It really should be a law review. And I'll never forget, whoever the administrative official I spoke with about it, her immediate response was, she said, wait a minute, we already have a civil rights journal. And I had to explain to her that, well, the African American perspective and interface with law extends beyond civil rights, right? And we interconnect and interface with the legal system in unique ways outside of the civil rights spectrum. So how about we have a journal that focuses on developing that perspective and bringing that perspective into the mainstream? And as has pretty much always been my experience with academic institutions, it was basically, okay, we won't be in your way. Okay. And as long as myself and the co-founder, Joe Mitchell, who was a third-year student, I was a second-year student. So we went out and did what was needed, raised money, et cetera, reached out to scholars, whether they were at the law school or other law schools, to pull it together and to make, an initial publication. Today, it has a different name, which escapes me at the moment, but the journal survives. It says something about social and civil justice. I just can't. Recently, somebody sent it to me and said, oh, this is what it's called.
They drew inspiration from the name of your institute.
Aha, you see? Who says we can't do it? Go back in time loop.
Or you founded something else.
Mm-hmm.
The Landslide magazine, which, for viewers is really the mainstay, the go-to of folks that want to know what's going on in the IP world, published by the ABA, IP law section, and it is their flagship magazine. And you had a role in founding it. So tell us how that came about.
Well, it's once again so interesting how I talked earlier about this collective effort to bring social justice into the IP regime. So it was through my work with Finnegan, and the late Don Dunner was one of the key partners who supported that, along with Tom Irving. His daughter, Lisa Dunner, had been asked by the ABA to establish Landslide. And as Lisa was forming the first editorial board, she reached out to me as one of a group of folk to be a part of that initial board. So, the launching it, the entire concept, that's like Lisa, right? Lisa is responsible for that happening. But as most people with big ideas do, they look around and they say, okay, well, who do I want with me on this enterprise? And I was privileged to be asked by her to be a part of this initial board. And in those early days, it was really, let's put together something that will not only be of interest to IP practitioners, right? This has to be the place to go where if you're an IP practitioner, yes, you can get the latest developments. But if you aren't an IP practitioner and you want to keep abreast of how do I get into that, or how do I at least, I'm a generalist, but I need to know what that is. And there was a lot of emphasis on that, and reaching out, pulling in people. The other great thing about it too was that, Lisa's vision, and I think supported by the ABA, was to bring in as many different perspectives as possible. So we would routinely look for people who were known leaders, but other people who were just coming up, also people that traditionally were not included. So it was very consistent with what I was already doing in terms of the CLE program, creating a space for people who would not traditionally be asked, right? But they were expert nonetheless. And so that was another aspect of Landslide. And I'm so pleased. I mean, I've not been directly involved since that initial couple of years that I was on the board, but I'm just so pleased to see that it's the kind of institution that you have described.
What I see is a thread that runs through your life.
Hmm.
You have this uncanny sense of finding a hole in society that needs to be filled. And you don't wait for somebody else to do it. You roll up your sleeves and you say, heck, if nobody's going to do it, I'll do it. And I'll not only do it, but I will inspire other people to do it with me. And the things that you have started, whether it's the journal or Landslide, have endured, or the Institute and the CLE program. I think that really is, in a world where everything is so transient, a huge testament, not just to your vision, but also to the enduring power of inspiration and perspiration.
Yeah.
So tell us, you must have had mentors in your life. And even as you look to the future, you may also be thinking about mentees. So let's start with mentors. Who would you say are the mentors in your life?
Well, certainly my parents, they right from the start, my dad was a big, pusher and motivator, brilliant man, never, as I said, didn't have the benefit of formal education, but I would come home from school and talk about things. And he'd say, oh, well, you're talking about this. So he's very, self-educated. So that really, propelled me. Once I moved into the profession, I would say that a really important mentor who you had a chance to meet, Ron Katz was a partner at Kudir Brothers and took me under his wing in a genuine way. I mean, in those days, I was the only Black associate in the New York office of Kudir Brothers. And indeed, for many years, although Kudir Brothers had offices around the world, I remember having a conversation with the head of the New York office, who was basically the head of the firm, worldwide. And one evening he said, so who are the other Black associates? And I said, well, I'm the only one, unless there's somebody in one of the other offices. And he says, well, I know about the other offices. And I said, oh, but he says, well, there are none, So, Ron Katz coming in, he was a lateral partner and, genuinely saying, well, I care about your career. I want to see what's going to happen with you. That was important. Actually, going back, another really important person. So there was this group that I was a part of when I was coming up in Harlem. Interestingly, and I have to just preface it by saying that because people will say, "Oh, well, I didn't know that you or your family was Catholic." We weren't, and I'm not. But it just goes to show where, as you were saying, seeing a need and filling it come from all different places. So it was a Catholic preacher. His name is John Meehan, and he's still alive, and we're going to be having a celebration for him in a couple of weeks. But he saw the Catholic Church in the 60s wanted to develop a program to get Black men more interested in the priesthood. And it fizzled, it didn't work. But he saw that this was a great idea, the structure of the program, and thought, hey, you know what, instead of priests, how about we try to focus on leadership? And it started in the 60s. I was able to be recruited in the mid 70s. And the things that he was able to teach us. And it was a collective process, because basically after the first group went through it, they all then became the teachers. And so everybody who goes through it, and through that, we learned about different social responsibilities. We read a lot about, politics and current events. He also took us on college trips. So the schools that we might hear about, like I heard about in Stuyvesant, had no real way to go out and look at them. And because he would, on his own time and own dime, he would get us all together and drive us up there, whatever, we'd get to see it. And that was another really important, mentor. And in fact, he was the one who said to me, yeah, where are you thinking of going to college? And he said, Amherst is the place for you. And I thought about it. And then more recently, after I became a law professor, folks like Warner Lawson, who's since retired, his area was commercial law. Steve Jamar, who we've worked together in bringing the idea of the IP Social Justice Institute into a reality. And just as the only other person doing IP at the law school, always, I've got another crazy idea like this CLE, or let's do a book on IP social justice. That was always a very important. And of course, the people that you meet throughout the profession and doing all these collaborative things. So I would say that those were some of the many, many people that have helped, shape how I do things and bring it to fruition.
And what about mentees? Who comes to mind when you think about your mentees, your legacy for the future?
Yeah. Well, see, the difficulty with that is that, in a way, you got to ask them, right? Do you think he was I would say that there are definitely people who I have had the pleasure of working with through the law school, people who've gone on to do great things. To what extent that I had any impact or influence, I don't know. Some people I think of, so there are people like Idris McKelvey, who is now Chief Patent Counsel for Estee Lauder, that I think as going through our program, and he was early in it, so he helped as a student to make the program a reality. There is a family, I call them the Williams family, because, and you got to see some of them presenting in the CLE program on Friday. The eldest, Aisha Williams, was the first. She was in many of my classes. She did the ethics presentation at the end. Ulysses Williams, who's now a patent attorney at Paul in New York City. The youngest, Yanni Williams, was in my class, but I don't think she does IP. So she's the furthest, from the circle. But Charlie Bingham, who I mentioned earlier, who conceived of the Tech Summit, and perhaps in some ways closest to home, Tasha Bunch, who's the program director at the Institute, and who is also an interlocutory attorney at the Trademark Trial and Appeals Board. In many respects, I just look at all of these people and so many others, who Izu Imewali, who's at Chase, and you got to see her present as well. I look at these people of the real definition of a mentee, I think, is someone who's involved in a mutual process. Someone who comes and they're bringing something to the table, right? And they're going to blossom and they're going to achieve without regard to what the mentor does. And these are all people who I think fit perfectly into that mold. I just had the good fortune of being in the right place at the right time to maybe just add a little bit of spice to their stew of accomplishment, right? That was going to be a wonderful main dish no matter what. But it was nice for me to have the opportunity to just sort of be along for the ride.
Was that something that you could see in them, this spark or this sparkle, that these are special individuals? I am going to invest in them, I'm going to keep in contact with them, and they're going to blossom?
Yeah, yeah. Something that they all have in common and others, you just, first off, their initiative, right? In all of these cases, these are people who are in your class, but who seek you out, right? They come to you and they say, here's something I want to do, or we've been talking about this topic and I want to do more, or I look at what we have, but I don't think it's enough. We need more programs, et cetera. So there is this initiative, there's this drive, there's this, that you talk with them and you see in their eyes what I was saying. They're going to go out, they're going to make some stuff happen, right? So I can make it a little easier by sharing with them some of my experience, right? Or I could let them go and stumble and get bruised, and they're going to achieve it no matter what. But it's that commitment, and then you test them a little bit. You say, well, okay, you want to try this? And they go out and they do it, and they invest their time. One of the things that my students know about me is that I say, listen, we're at Howard. You can make your dedication to the mission abstract and theoretical or concrete. When you go beyond just attending class, when you help to create new organizations, take leadership position in those organizations, put together programs, panels, go out into the community, do IP pro bono work, right? When you do those things, you can come to me anytime for whatever kind of support that you need, whether relevant to those projects or just to helping you move along in your career, because you're contributing your time and effort and energy to others. And if my students can do that, I can do no less. And so when students come to me and they want more, can I meet with you outside of your office hours? Can you advise me on this paper, my note, whatever it is, my independent study? I know you're not officially. My first question for them is, okay, so what are you doing outside of that? Are you a part of the IP Students Association? Are you part of our new Fashion Law Society? What pro bono internship or externship are you a part of? My first question to them is, what are you doing outside of your responsibility as a student, right? Because you're asking me to do something outside of my formal responsibility as a professor. And it's the ones who have something to say, this is what I'm doing, or this is what I would like to do. They immediately move right up to the top of my list.
Well, it sounds like they need to overcome the initial skepticism and make a case for their case. Uh, and I think it's certainly appropriate. Now, the last question. You have achieved a tremendous amount and have an amazing life. And you're now thinking about the next chapter. What does that next chapter look like to you?
Well, let's see. Well, I think in the immediate sense, I would like to do more of the type of national concrete impact that we've been talking about, both through USIPA as well as Howard and some of the other programs. I'm working with a bunch of people at USIP, including one Daryl Lim, as well as some other folk, to really help Congress to move forward on this, to this affirmative IP agenda, including, if you don't mind my pointing to a project that you have. You have this fantastic plan for this national conference to take place later this year in Washington, D.C., that will bring together just a range of IP thought leaders, whether they're in corporations or academia, policymakers, to have that kind of conversation that I think will generate, part of this agenda that we can hand back over to Congress and say, this is what. So projects like that, I'm really interested in, bringing IP education to K through 12, bringing it to grassroots community. I mean, really seeing what IP is in the total American political economy, seeing that move to a whole new level, right? Like I said earlier, I want us to look at IP the way that we look at athletics. I mean, you know, if you, on any nightly news, there are two things you know they're going to talk about: the weather and sports, right? I want us to be looking at IP that way, right? And in particular for many underserved communities, because America is in many respects the great immigrant story, you know, whether the Mayflower or, you know, Statue of Liberty or what have you. And IP is the great equalizer and the great opportunity. IP is not a zero-sum game, right? If you write a song, I can write a song about that same idea, that same love lost, that same feeling. If you invent a new can opener, I can still come up with another way to invent a can opener. And the great thing about it is that as a second comer, the way our IP system is set up, I get to learn from what you've done, right? So I think that both immediately and long term, that is something that I'd like to do. As you know, I have the book, the IP Social Justice Handbook that Steve Jamar and I have edited, and we've both wrote many of the chapters and also recruited many the leading IP scholars to each give their take on what social justice looks like in terms of their field of IP. So I'm encouraged to see where the impact that's gonna have. Expanding the HBCU IP and Tech Law Summit. We have 4 of the 6 schools that have been participating, 5th school working its way in, and then we're developing a means to bring the 6th school in because they don't have an IP program to start. But then moving beyond the immediate, eventually at some point, I'm going to run out of steam and retire from full-time teaching. But I think even when I do that, I will keep my hand in through the Institute. I think the Institute is a unique entity in the American IP topography. I think that there are things that the Institute, with its collective approach, that we've been able to do, particularly by partnering with other institutions. We partner with various schools. We partner with you at Penn State. We partner with John Marshall at UIC in Chicago. We partner with George Mason in Washington, DC. But we also partner with non-academic institutions. We have informal partnership relationships on both sides of the IP aisle. Entities like Public Knowledge, which is an IP pro bono policy activist that you look at more so from the user perspective, but then also the MPA, the Motion Picture Association, which is more of a content, but I think one of the best and most touching compliments I ever got in terms of all of this sort of stuff. I was chatting with someone, a scholarly colleague, who is also a scholar activist, gets involved in this stuff. And he said, you know what, Lateef, I talk with people on both sides, tech and content. You're one of the few people that everybody says that they can work with, and for me, that's it. I'm like, okay, that's the best possible thing that you can say, because that's how IP should work. And you should be able to look at all of the different sides and see how we can get something, done together. So I would like that to be a big part of my third stage. Once I'm no longer teaching on a full-time basis, to not let that stop the dance, right? In fact, to give me more time, to impact things on the national and policy and legislative level.
It sounds like the best is yet to be. And folks on watching this should stay tuned. Follow Lateef wherever he appears. He's not on social media, but I'm sure you'll read about him and you'll find ways to reach out to him. And I'd say just in the last 20 years, you have help transform IP, not just in degree, because technology does that. IP keeps up with technology, not always perfectly, but that's more of a change in degree. I think if you can really succeed in infusing social justice in thinking about IP on a day-to-day basis, that really would be a change in kind, and it would be a change that is more profound than you would have seen in the last 200 years. And I think it's going to make for a kinder system, a more robust system, and a more dynamic system that brings everybody into the conversation. So we are proud partners, and I'm so glad that we had this opportunity to walk through some of the highlights of your life, of your work, and your leadership. I don't think anybody would be disappointed and say that I had misrepresented when I said at the start of this that you would see why I invited Lateef Mtima to be a guest on this Profiles in Leadership series. So thank you very much, Lateef, for joining us.
Well, thanks as always, Daryl. You present me with great opportunities to do things. And as you and I have chatted, repeatedly, you have this incredible energy to be in so many different places and to work with so many different people. And the opportunity to follow you from institution to institution, where you're sort of like the Johnny Appleseed of IP. You just roam the countryside, drop some seeds here, this blossoms, and now it's time to do. So to be a part of a conversation like this and have the opportunity to, have this discussion is not only a privilege, but it's also given me an opportunity to look back and look forward and say, oh, okay, what is next? Let me give some more thought to that. So thanks very much. I've enjoyed it, and look forward to our doing so many more things in the near future.
And we can say amen to that.
Here, here.